the idea really of this job is to get their hospital ready for what we just saw this last year. It's all about that. And I think that's what's been so difficult to get really healthcare leaderships or healthcare leader on board, like the C-suite on board, is because you're kind of preparing for this thing that may or may not happen in a lot of their minds.
Public health. It's on everyone's mind these days, from hand washing to emerging pathogens. Welcome to Transmission Control, an infection prevention podcast focused on your appetite for trailblazing thought, discussion, and innovations that will help you make informed decisions. Each episode, we speak with public health experts and safety champions from across the globe as they share their experiences, passion, and opinions. From investigative journalism to medical publications, we tackle real-world barriers to halting the spread of disease. Whether you are tuning in for education, inspiration, or to hear the stories that need to be told, thank you for joining us. And now, get ready to blast off with your weekly injection of insight on transmission control.
This week on Transmission Control, Larry and I speak with Jacob Hutcherson, CEO at Clutch Recruitment, and that's exactly what today's topic is going to be about. It's going to be about staffing and recruiting infection control practitioners into the industry. And I won't even say just hospitals, although I think traditionally that has been a focus, but the industry has shifted, as Jacob will tell us in this interview today. And we're going to be talking about workforce and shortages and the impacts. It's going to be quite a conversation. I'm excited to talk to Jacob today. And Larry, I think this is a very different topic than many of the ones that we've had already to date on this podcast.
Yes, the issue of training, the issue of staffing, the issue of workforce and filling spots in hospitals and salaries based on supply and demand. This is something we haven't really talked about too much, and something that I think all is extremely interesting to listen to, and I'm sure I will learn a lot. And I particularly am looking forward to hearing about how we have kind of this pre-COVID world versus the post-COVID and what impact that might have had on staffing in terms of dissuading or encouraging people to enter this wonderful field of infection prevention.
All right, we're going to be right back after a short break with Jacob Hutcherson. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Dr. Lawrence Muscarella.
From 17 Studios, let's get into it. This is Transmission Control.
Joining us now is Jacob Hutcherson, CEO at Clutch Recruitment. And I've been waiting for this interview for a while, Jacob, because, I just think there's so many insights to be gained from professional recruiters, especially around industry trends. And I know that there's going to be a big workforce shortage, or maybe there already is. And I really want to talk through that with you. It's kind of my pet topic these days on several of my podcasts, because I just think healthcare needs to be really ready for the tidal wave that is coming. So with that in mind, thanks so much for coming on the show today. It's great to have you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm excited about it.
All right. So I never tell anybody I'm going to do this, but before we get started, I want to do a little bit of an icebreaker. So why don't you tell us what you did over the last 18 months during the pandemic to occupy yourself while you were somewhat socially isolated?
Goodness, 18 months. So, I had my second, I didn't. My wife had our second child. My daughter was born in this past May, and then I already had a 3-year-old. So honestly, I just spent a lot of time with family and and helping my wife out, because we're both working from home now, or at least last year we were both working from home. So that was where my mind was throughout the pandemic.
And it's hard because you don't have the help with the child care. My sister had a kindergartner, a second grader, and just trying to educate the children while still meeting their job responsibilities. It's a 2-income family. That could be such a challenge. And boy, with them being that young, Jacob, I can imagine it was hard to get some quiet time to talk to your customers and some of the infection control practitioners out there.
Yeah, well, it was a handful. And I'll tell you, because I'm in the infection control space, when the pandemic broke out, my life got tremendously busier as far as work goes. So I was at home, but the amount of effort that I was putting in and the amount of calls I was putting in and the urgency with everybody I was speaking to was just higher than I've ever seen it. So it was a whirlwind of an 18 months. Things didn't really slow down at all for me.
That's a really good point, because we had an interview with Buffy Lloyd Krejci, and she's a consultant in the infection control arena. And one of the things she was talking about was that we already, especially in long-term care, just did not have the infection control practitioners in the industry to the level that we should to be able to focus and prepare for an event like that. Where did you see the most explosion around staffing? Was it all in hospitals? Was it more in long-term care? Or was it just entirely across the board?
Well, I mean, it was certainly across the board, but historically you've had this lack of support for the infection prevention department in general. So everybody I'm talking to, I mean, the most important thing, or like the first thing they're looking at in a new job, is if their leadership supports the infection prevention program. And a lot of that is based on staffing, just how many people, how many full-time infection preventionists they have per X amount of beds at the hospital. And so you can kind of gauge what priority they have. And most hospitals across the country were understaffed as far as what the CDC would recommend or what AFIC would recommend. So that was already a reality in hospitals. Then, not too long before COVID hit, you have all these extra requirements at LTACs and ambulatory centers that healthcare systems were already preparing for. And then COVID came and hit, and then it made it that much more not only important from a regulatory standpoint, but important just for patient safety.
Jacob, I'm very curious to know about getting into the whole field of staffing. And maybe you can kind of address that for me. If I kind of was a kid and someone said to me, what do you want to be when you grow up? I don't know that staffing and training personnel necessarily would be high on my list then. It would certainly be now. But how did you kind of get into this in the first place? Where were you and that led you down this path so that you got into such an important field, particularly that when COVID hit, you were so prepared to deal with it?
Yeah. So actually, when I got into it, I didn't even know or understand that really a recruiting industry existed. So I kind of fell into an admin role at a local, like, small firm where I was helping. And this was kind of the niche that they had carved their way into, this and all of healthcare quality. And then after kind of listening in for a year, I decided, you know what, I could probably do the recruiting in, make a little bit more money than what I would have done in this kind of admin role. And then really fell in love with the industry and really infection prevention as a whole. So, I mean, I've been in this in the infection prevention niche for almost 8 years now, just speaking to these folks every day. And then before that, I guess kind of my skills or experience that kind of came into it, I didn't realize it, but I had a company. It was kind of an NFL, like a passion project, where I was running a NFL website where I had at one point over 150 writers writing for me and covering the NFL. And it was great. I was trying to find a way to make money off of it. What that turned into, though, was really a minor league for these big publications. Every time I got some progress there, they would be hired away. So what my day-to-day job ended up turning into was recruiting writers. And I did that, like I said, more as a passion project side job for many years before I walked into the healthcare industry and kind of an actual career. So I've really been at this for like 20 years now, more as a hobby or whatnot. But yeah, it kind of comes naturally.
Kind of like a grassroots approach, that when you have a platform and you bring people in and they work for you and then they get so good they go somewhere else, your whole job becomes less focusing on the NFL than recruiting people to work for your
It was all talent acquisition. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
That's funny. We've got something in common that way, because that's how I found podcasting. My first nursing job, where I was in an office setting, and it just wasn't the same runaround. I had lots of downtime. And so I started blogging about the Boston Celtics, and then eventually was like, I'm running out of things to write about. I'm just not good at writing. I'm great at talking. And then the next thing I knew, I created the podcast, and, away it went from there. And so very similar backgrounds there, although I never managed 150 writers as a pastime. That definitely sounds like a job.
It was a lot. I called it a job for about a year, but it only lasted so long.
Well, when it comes to staffing infection professionals and preventionists, what type of, if we can get even more specific, what are the types of traits that you're looking for? Specifically, what are the objectives that these professionals would want to achieve on a day-to-day basis? We know we want to minimize the risk of infection. So that's kind of obvious, and we all know that. But you go many, many layers deeper than that. What else are their responsibilities so that when you're talking with them and interviewing them, you can kind of vet out their knowledge and know whether they're really qualified for these types of tasks? But the first thing is, what are their objectives? Many of us know that, but many of us are not entirely clear on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, like I mentioned before, I mean, they're ultimately looking for a place that's going to support them and what they're trying to do, which the ultimate goal in all of that is going to be patient safety. So there's kind of in this field, you've kind of got two kind of philosophies, I guess, almost. You have the clinical background, which are kind of your floor nurses or old floor nurses that have kind of transitioned into infection control and kind of learned it and then kind of picked up the science stuff as they go, but really enjoy interacting with people, families, patients, employees at the hospital, really to just create an environment of patient safety. But then you've also got this crop of infection prevention professionals that are very data-minded and very scientific. They kind of have this epidemiology background or this microbiology background or something along those lines and really prefer the surveillance end of the job. So that's tracking the data of healthcare-acquired infections and passing that through NHSN. So there's kind of two different things. And I think the data-minded people kind of prefer to be behind the desk and kind of analyze and review data and kind of look at the outcomes and figure out things that they can do and the changes they can make in that area. And then you've got the more clinical mind that is used to being out on the floor and interacting with people. And I think hospitals really need both of those personalities in a department, but hospitals have very specific needs and wants for that position. I mean, they have different reasons for that, obviously. And then I just try to match ultimately what the hospital wants to that particular candidate.
So what about supply chain issues as well? You talked about surveillance and infection and preventing infections. Did the issue of supply chain management come up for infection control practitioners these days? And when you're kind of interviewing and talking and training the staff and vetting them for positions, is that something that in the past may not have been so big, but now having some supply chain management, for example, to make sure we have sufficient amount of PPE during a pandemic, for example, is that kind of that management skill important these days?
Yeah, I mean, everybody is coming in this role and kind of doing a risk analysis to kind of figure out where their potential exposures are, to kind of figure out how to go about it. So yeah, I mean, that's the whole planning. I mean, the idea really of this job is to get their hospital ready for what we just saw this last year. And it's all about that. And I think that's what's been so difficult to get really healthcare leaderships or healthcare leader on board, like the C-suite on board, is because you're kind of preparing for this thing that may or may not happen in a lot of their minds, and which we know it does. And obviously it did recently. So yeah, I think the ultimate battle that they have faced really every day for the last decade really is to show their importance and help people understand, yes, we can get fined a lot of money if we don't do these certain things, but this is about patient safety. And we need to have this hospital prepared in the case an outbreak happens. We need to have isolation procedures in place. We need to have, like you mentioned, we need to have the equipment there if something were to go. Like these protocols and these outlines need to be in place. And that's what these people are ultimately there for. But again, I think the real challenge of the job is getting leadership to give them appropriate budgets to actually be able to get the hospital ready to handle something like that.
Wow, what an unfortunate way to make a point. And I think there's
Right.
probably a lot of people out there listening to this podcast that feel that way. And so as it relates to staffing, you kind of alluded to the fact that there was already a little bit of a growing need. So maybe they were starting to get some attention, especially in those, non-hospital settings. I don't want to say non-acute because you said surgery centers and that care is still very much acute. But even when you talk about surgery centers, you kind of said the profile is microbiology, maybe more data driven. Then you have this other, former floor nurses. And one thing that I've run into a lot as I've worked with infection control practitioners, we've got a couple of other podcasts, and Larry talked about the supply chain concern. And all of a sudden, gloves and PPE, this becomes a big impact on the infection control practitioner's ability to do their job and support the hospital. But then there's a couple of other areas that maybe weren't so directly related, but I've got a podcast on sterile processing, and I have another podcast on the operating room. And one thing that I've consistently received from like different APIC chapters or professionals is we didn't come from surgery. And there's a huge boom in attention to sterile processing and surgical services. But a lot of times the floor nurses are just not comfortable in that environment. And so they don't always get involved, in that surgical setting. So I really wanted to ask this question because it appears to me that any infection control practitioner really is either multifaceted or has experience in certain areas. It's almost like you need a team to cover all the bases. And especially in the surgery center setting, like how hard was it to find, candidates for those jobs that either did or didn't have experience, but obviously would have to be experienced in surgery to be able to fill that role?
Yeah. So it's difficult. And most of the work that I've done, I should say, is in short-term acute care hospitals. And I think with these extra requirements and kind of the more outpatient facilities or surgical facilities or whatever it may be, I think hospitals are still kind of formulating plans for that. So a lot of times we would see kind of your standard staff and infection prevention role, just kind of as a side note in the job. Maybe one day a week, they're also going to spend time in a surgery center, or some people will have dedicated infection preventionists to that surgery center. I mean, there's a lot of different kind of ways to structure. And I don't know that there's necessarily a way everybody's doing it across the board right now. Everybody's trying to figure it out because the reality is there's a shortage just in the short-term acute care world. And now you're having all of these requirements added on top of it. And these people just don't exist. And I can tell you from talking to, thousands of infection prevention professionals, it takes a year to learn it. It's not something you can go and teach somebody in 2 weeks and then say, you're off to the races and go. It takes elaborate training. So, right now, one of the biggest things that we're seeing is people are wanting experienced infection control people, most of which are retired because they're the only people that are there able to do these assignments, to come in for 6 months to train some internal person that knows the area and loves the hospital that they think will be there for a minute, and then spending the money just to train an internal person. That's the majority of our interim work right now, is to do that. Because the people just don't exist right now.
That's crazy. So, what's going to compound this is you're telling me that there was a workforce shortage before, and then it got compounded by these more non-acute settings. And then we had this whole issue with the pandemic and proving the point that we were already not paying enough attention to this area. And I want to drive it back to
that. Sorry to interrupt, but just one step further, when the pandemic hit, who do you think is being blamed when this happens? When the hospital's not set up, they're going to these people who have been pushing for a higher budget and pushing for these things to go into place for years. And then they're the ones catching the blame for the hospital not being ready. And so the amount of people that have left this industry that really should have been the most valuable people to help with this pandemic is surprisingly high, just because the amount of frustration and pressure that they ran into when this pandemic hit.
I'm hearing a little bit of a paradox here, Jacob. We have these infection prevention professionals and practitioners where they're focusing on infection. And then we have a pandemic come along where they then would be focusing on that pandemic. But it seems as if when the pandemic hit, these ICPs were pulled away from practicing infection prevention, at least as far as maybe other pathogens are concerned. In other words, we started focusing solely on COVID. Can you give the listeners some insight that when the infection professionals then pulled away from focusing on other tasks to focus solely on COVID, what adverse impact did this have on the spread of other types of diseases in the hospital? Can you give us a little insight on that?
Yeah, I think it's to be seen, really. I think we're still going to kind of see the implications of everything. But you're right. I mean, that was definitely a reality. I mean, just for an example, I helped staff 6, 7, 8 infection prevention people at Emory as soon as the pandemic hit last March or April, whenever it was. And what was interesting is they were being brought on just to do the regular day-to-day job of the infection preventionist so that their current infection prevention team could handle the duties of COVID. Yes, I mean, obviously COVID did fall under their general job description, but at the same time, that was a small, isolation procedures and kind of this disease control was a small piece of what they do. And it did take up their attention. So yeah, I think it's to be seen, really, the implications of that. I mean, I can tell you just from speaking with people, ultimately it led to a lot of frustration and a lot of just people kind of just really at a loss and not really knowing what to do because they just weren't capable of the amount of work that was there.
And some of their responsibilities then were addressing the procurement, for example, of PPE instead of necessarily doing surveillance and monitoring for other types of infections. For example, superbug infections linked to reusable medical equipment. They weren't able to focus on that, which is really under the purview of their responsibilities, because they might have to focus on a supply chain issue. Is that something that you heard occurred often or not as much as I might anticipate it did?
No, I think you're right. It did. And I heard stories of it plenty. I will say one thing that I think was a good thing to come from this is a big thing that infection prevention professionals will preach is that infection prevention truly is a kind of a culture for the entire hospital. And it's something that the entire hospital needs to be on board with and kind of get behind. When I think historically, I think infection prevention people are kind of viewed as kind of policemen that are just kind of making their job harder because there's extra things that they have to check off when they're doing procedures. And it's just kind of an annoying thing. So a big role was to change the culture of the hospital. And I think when the pandemic hit, other healthcare workers realized wow, we can't rely on these 2 people at the hospital to do all of this. It truly is going to take an effort from everybody. And so I think it helped, again, unfortunately, prove a point that it is the entire hospital's job to do this. So just people that were there just had to chime in and help out.
So is that transient? Do you see that kind of, it happened during COVID and everyone really worked together and did things that they might not otherwise have done? Do you think that really is permanently established as the paradigm moving forward? Or is the pragmatic approach really saying that it can't be that way, that when these types of pandemics occur, everyone may have to work together in a different way to fight this pandemic, then we kind of go back to baseline? Or is there a whole new baseline, a whole new paradigm we have now?
I think it's a combination of both. I mean, I don't think it's one clear-cut direction. Yeah, I really do think it's a little of both.
I want to talk a little bit more about the workforce shortage component of this because
sans pandemic, as you call it, Justin.
Sansdemic. Yeah.
Sansdemic, I beg your pardon.
I don't call it that. MZ calls that. They are labor force economists, and so they've been doing a lot of modeling about that. But right, absolutely. I want to talk about the Sansdemic because, but before I even do that, when you recruit IP professionals, it sounds to me like there was always kind of a shortage. And so that's already compounding it. But so when did recruiting IP professionals start? And how was it traditionally staffed before that? Because I'm going to tie this into how do we fill this gap? And we're going to talk about some new grads. And, if anybody's listening and maybe is not an infection control practitioner today, but wants to get into it, I really want to tie that in because we obviously have to fill this void in the industry. But how did it used to be? And when did staffing like what you do today even begin?
So from my understanding, just from talking to people, and this won't be super detailed, but from the late 80s, early 90s, I guess, is when infection prevention really became a thing. And what happened is that there were these positions that would be created, and then they would just pull a floor nurse off of floor nursing and say, hey, do this and learn this. And it slowly kind of became its own field. And so what's created the initial shortage is you have all these floor nurses that kind of entered the industry at the same time that are all getting to retirement age at the same time. So there's this vacuum that's there. And the problem is that with a general floor nursing position, you've got people leaving college that can go right into it. And I guess their clinicals or their studies have focused in on whatever area and they can go. Well, clinicals doesn't cover infection prevention, at least not as a field. In general, you might cover some infection prevention tactics, but as far as what these people's day-to-day roles are, that's not covered. So you've got a bunch of nurses who have been essentially self-taught leaving. You don't have any new people coming into the industry, at least through the normal path. And then you've also got this dynamic to where the only real schooling you can get that's focused on infection prevention is more of a master's in public health degree with the focus in epidemiology. So you have this more science background, which a lot of hospitals don't want or don't need for whatever reason. Some of that's because, well, the last person that was in that role was a nurse, so we got to get a nurse for this role. Some of it's just that, and it's just...
By nurse, you mean RN?
An RN, yeah. And so it's just historically been that, so they don't change the job description when it opens. So I'm having to do a lot of educating to HR departments or talent acquisition departments or even hiring managers and be like, I understand that you had a nurse working here for the last 10 years, but half of this industry is non-nurses. And that may be a little different, but that's the reality. And if you're wanting somebody or you're willing to take somebody younger or earlier on in their career out of college, then you're going to need to look at a non-nurse situation. Otherwise, you're going to be training a nurse.
So let me just ask you a question around that too, right? Because I think nurses really value certification. Just being one myself, when you become a specialist in a certain area, whether it's the CNOR, I have a certification for sterile processing, like people seek out certifications that really exemplify their specialty. And there's obviously certification for infection control practitioners as well through APIC. But I guess when you start talking about backgrounds in epidemiology, microbiology, maybe medical technology, does this really raise the level of importance for certification to sort of level that playing field or to give that sort of validation of a baseline knowledge? Like, do you think certification is going to become more and more critical as hospitals look to fill these positions and maybe not through a traditional paradigm that's clearly not going to work? As you said, we all have heard it in the nursing field that all these nurses are leaving. They were all in graduate programs in the 70s and now they're retiring. And that's what it is. And never mind the fact that the sansdemic, thanks for putting out my favorite word, Larry, but the sansdemic just means there's going to be less workers, there in general. And we're going to have this aging population that's more and more vulnerable to infection all at the same time. And those same people are the ones that are vacating the jobs that need to be filled.
The perfect storm.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, that certification is so important. And it was interesting because pre-pandemic, it was starting to be something to where it was like, you need to have your certification or you're not getting hired. And this is a certification in infection control. It's by the Certifying Board of Infection Control, CBIC. But post-pandemic, now there's such a shortage. People are willing to hire anybody that's spent any time in an infection prevention role. It's interesting, but I will say, if you're a non-nurse in this industry, you almost have to have a CIC to get hired. Because, like I said, we're already having to do a lot of convincing on the front end to get hiring managers to consider a non-nurse. And then so if I can get them to cross that and get them to be willing to entertain a non-nurse, then you've got to have something on that resume to demonstrate that you know your stuff. And the CIC is really the only thing out there right now to do that. And one issue with it, though, see, previously they used to require 2 years of infection prevention experience before you're even allowed to test for the certification. Now, they dropped that requirement recently in the last couple of years, although they still strongly recommend having 2 years of experience before you sit to take. But one requirement is that you have an infection prevention role and responsibility, and your hiring manager has to sign off on it saying that you do before you can take the test. So it's not a certification really that you can get while you're in college to demonstrate knowledge. I mean, this is a certification that demonstrates hands-on experience in addition to the knowledge.
When we think about the supply and demand model, all of these topics and concepts you're talking about with the shortages, is this causing, and maybe not hiring a non-nurse, is this causing the salaries to increase? Is this putting greater financial burden on the hospitals, or is this making things easier for the hospitals from a financial economic standpoint?
The salaries were already increasing pretty dramatically each year as this kind of shortage began to reveal itself. Post-pandemic, the jumps that I've seen in salary ranges are unreal. Just give one example. I was working a position in the Northeast. I can't identify what it was or who it was with necessarily, but it was a director level over a large academic hospital. We were given a salary range that went up to about 120,000 was the max range. That was given 7 months ago. They ultimately ended up hiring somebody for 165,000 after a market analysis of what they thought they should pay. They gave them a 15% bonus each year on top of that, like a management bonus, in addition to temporary housing for 6 months and a $20,000 sign-on bonus. So you're talking about in the span of a year, increasing the total package of pay by close to $100,000. That's purely because of the shortage and demand that's going on. Salaries are way up. So what I can say, if you've got any infection control people listening right now that have been working in the same place for 10 years, if your hospital hasn't adjusted your pay, you should probably have that conversation. And if you can't have that conversation, then there are hospitals nearby that are hiring for quite a bit more than what they were hiring just a couple of years ago.
And what kind of impact are you seeing this on patient safety and quality? You had the gap, you had the shortage, the salaries are going up. Typically, the economic model would say that those openings and those vacancies are going to be filled. Do we see some kind of a shifting then, where are we actually striving and moving toward increased in infection prevention, increased patient safety as a result of these increases in salary that is motivating more people to come into this field? The upshot of all of this, is this really helping patient safety? And it sounds to me like it certainly could be. We're bringing in more qualified, dedicated people who are really being rewarded for their services. In kind of a final thought of mine, well, what is the impact of all of this in the spread of pathogens in hospitals and on the prevention of healthcare-acquired infections?
Well, I think what you're seeing is you've got a lot of hospitals that weren't paying attention at all to the recommended staffing requirements. I think those hospitals are paying attention now. So purely from a manpower perspective, yeah, I think patient safety is going to be more critical, and I think also are going to be impacted significantly. And then you've also got, again, just like the culture of the hospital, I think every employee at a hospital now sees the significance of this and why these seemingly dumb things 2 years ago were actually important. And so I think the combination of those things, I do think that patient safety is going to improve. I mean, you've still got infection control people kind of catching their breath and kind of playing catch up on some of the things they may have let slide over the past year. I mean, even Joint Commission, from what I understand, is running 6 and 7 months behind in their regular evaluations. So everything's kind of behind, and I think we're going to see some like catch up. I think ultimately, yeah, we do see better patient care and better patient safety, but I think it's still a little too early to see the full ramifications of it. But I do think we're trending in the right direction for sure.
Is data collection an issue there, especially when they're so stressed? Is it just difficult to get the information to make a data-driven point on if you increase staffing, it's going to have this impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and some of this is based on assumption, but you've got to think that their reporting is behind in most places. I mean, the amount of interims that we used to get, people that I'm finding, just to catch people up as far as their reportables. That was a big thing before COVID hit. So after COVID hit, when it's taken their attention, I can only imagine how far behind these hospitals are in their typical day-to-day job, Larry, like you were referencing. They're definitely behind. More staffing is going to help catch up faster than I think that would have been like previously. But that's what I'm saying. There's still some catching up to do before we really get to see what the new landscape looks like.
So if anything, COVID then maybe has changed the landscape so dramatically that if there's any kind of silver lining to this, we're all safer in terms of all types of infections from hospitals as a direct consequence of COVID and what it has taught us and what it has forced us to do to adjust to its demands. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think and I hope and I believe now that most hospitals have a much better shot of getting the financial support that they've needed for years. Is it going to be as much as they want? Probably not. You can always have more. You can always do it. But it's at least going to give the C-level people enough of a picture of how big of a deal this could be and why this is so important. And that comes not only patient safety, but also just the fines and whatnot that hospitals have incurred through all of this. I mean,
I can only imagine, because at a time when revenues are down, to get pounded by fines and everything else, it really compounds the issue. And 10 years ago, accountable care came along and disrupted the payment model. So those margins were already small and they were put under a squeeze, and then they were challenged by an unprecedented virus. So Jacob, go ahead. Any final thoughts? I was going to say.
Yeah, well, let me jump in. It just kind of hit me. At the height of COVID, at least, a lot of hospitals were shutting down surgeries. And shutting down surgeries eliminates a lot of the typical infection prevention roles. So, Larry, we talked about, I don't know how that I kind of left that out of my kind of story there. But yeah, these surgeries weren't going on. And most of a lot of what infection control people are doing is making sure, I mean, this goes into the sterile processing too, but just making sure that patients are being cared for in the way that they should when they have open wounds and are going through things to prevent infections. So when that responsibility was removed from the hospital, that freed up some time to be able to focus on COVID.
Well, Jacob, this was really insightful. And I think just it gives us a high level understanding of where the industry is at a whole, and on a high level, but also I can't stress enough how much I think Larry put it best. We're headed for a brick wall. I don't know exactly how you put it, Larry, but there's really quite a wave coming. There's going to be a big impact with this shortage of staffing. And I just hope we don't repeat some of the same problems that we've had in the past, just by not having enough people to address the concerns of the future. So you did a great job today. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jacob.
That was Jacob Hutcherson, CEO at Clutch Recruitment. And, Larry, I got connected with Jacob, and I know a lot of folks in the professional recruiting business, not just for infection control practitioners, but also in nursing and sterile processing, all these different fields. And one thing that just keeps coming up over and over, and you astutely asked this question during the interview, but this workforce shortage, and then what is it having as an impact,
right,
on, salaries, because it's the basics of supply and demand.
Right.
When there's not enough supply and the demand is high, and we walked through that very well in this interview, but the costs always rise. That's just how it works. And so, it's having an impact on the industry pretty significantly. But the other thing that I really took away from this conversation is staffing is one issue, but then the other issue is really around qualifications and training. And you can't even really bring in a new grad to do this job, not only because they don't have the experience, but a lot of these facilities really want a nurse. They want somebody who's certified. You've got to, as Jacob pointed out, you've got to have 2 years to be able to sit for that certification. And so even the runway for replenishing this workforce, as the demand is also potentially doubling,
right,
is going to be a real challenge. And it's going to require some proactive efforts, not only for staffing agencies and for hospitals, but I would say even colleges, universities, nursing programs, they need to show potential candidates for those programs that there's so many different paths to go. And maybe by even building in some certification programming, they can meet that need more quickly.
So it looks like there's going to be a new norm that we're talking about. And as the salaries for these ICPs, the infection control practitioners and preventionists, it does raise an interesting question. When we have a fixed amount of money to spend and we're going to have to start allocating more of that money to this field, where is that money coming from? What might become deficient, or Ideally, that won't happen. We'll find new ways of raising funds. But I kind of imagine that water balloon where when you squeeze one end, it swells on the other, and then you go back to that end and it can squeeze back. So when you take from one end to give to another,
somebody's got to lose something.
Exactly. One end of the balloon is lost, the other gains. So I'm kind of curious how that's going to play out. And there's realities in this world where we don't just print money in central supply in the basements. So we'll have to see in this new norm. I'm proud and glad to hear that infection control is going to continue to get the attention that it warrants, and the value that it brings is going to be rewarded through increased salaries. I mean, I think that's absolutely great. And if there's an additional silver lining that COVID might have brought for us, it's that this infection prevention is really serious stuff, and people need to be paid in order to accomplish the responsibilities. But let's hope that other important tasks and responsibilities and staffers in other parts of the hospital do not pay the price for that. Let's just keep our fingers crossed on that.
Yeah, that shift might just end up making the job even that much harder, depending on where the resources financially are taken from or what other budgets get squeezed.
Exactly.
That's a really, really good point. And, you know, at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of, and I'll say this is a skilled trade. There's going to be a lot of need for skilled trades, whether they're college educated or not, all across as a result of this sandsdemic. It'll be interesting to see how the industry shifts. I'd love to hear from somebody out there if they're interested in joining us on one of these interviews to really talk about what's being done potentially in the industry to get ahead of this. I think that's an important second part of this conversation. Jacob, you did a very nice job today. Thanks for joining us. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Transmission Control by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, as well as Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes by downloading our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Larry and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Transmission Control.